I was sitting next to her at the dinner table, candles, red wine, her parents right across from us, when I felt her hand find mine under the cloth and hold on. Not gently. She gripped it. She leaned in close to my ear. Short breath. Voice low enough that no one else in that room could have heard a word of it. "Please kiss me." I looked at her. 1 second. 2 seconds. The reason I hesitated wasn't that I didn't want to. The reason was, she was my roommate. Her parents were sitting 3 feet away, and 30 seconds before that, my ex-girlfriend had just walked out the front door. Before I could do anything, she leaned up and kissed me. Right on the lips. Soft, brief, deliberate, the kind of kiss that belongs to someone who has already made up their mind and isn't second-guessing it. I went completely still. Behind us, I heard footsteps stop, then the door closed. I turned and looked at her parents. They weren't surprised. They just looked at each other, and then both of them smiled. Small, quiet smiles, the kind that belonged to two people who had already figured it out and were just waiting for confirmation. To understand why I didn't pull away and why that was the best decision I've ever made, I have to start from the beginning. My name is Cal, 31 years old, structural engineer at a consulting firm in Portland, Oregon. I rented this apartment 3 years ago with my girlfriend at the time, Jade. We moved in together because it felt like the logical next step, the way you make decisions in your late 20s when you're more afraid of falling behind some invisible schedule than you are of making the wrong choice. It made sense on paper. Most things that cost you later make sense on paper. Jade left 14 months before that dinner. She left in the middle of a meal quietly, precisely like she had rehearsed it. She set her fork down, looked at me and said, "You never make me feel anything." I didn't argue. I set my own fork down, said okay, and started clearing the dishes. That was the whole conversation. I posted the spare room because I couldn't cover the rent alone. That's what I told myself. I didn't think about the silence that had settled into the apartment after she left, or the way it had started to feel less like peace and more like evidence of something I wasn't ready to examine. The apartment had its own character by then. It smelled like coffee and old wood. There was a small crack in the kitchen wall shaped like a sideways letter L that I'd never patched, not out of laziness. I'd repainted that entire section twice. I always stopped right before the crack. I didn't know why. I told myself it didn't matter. Of everyone who responded to my listing, she was the only one who didn't ask about price first. Her email was 3 sentences. The second one, "Which direction does the bedroom window face? I need morning light to work." No small talk, no preamble, just the one thing she actually needed to know. I gave her a showing. She took the room. Nora Calloway, 28 years old, freelance design editor, working from home most days, with strong opinions about natural light. She'd grown up in Vermont, moved to Portland 2 years earlier after a relationship that ended badly, and had been quietly rebuilding her life ever since. She moved in with a collapsible bookshelf, a mocha pot, and a shoebox of film photographs she never put up on any wall. That last detail stayed with me. The photos stayed in the box, tucked between 2 books she hadn't opened yet. Like she wasn't sure yet whether she was staying. We lived what you'd call parallel lives, schedules offset, cooking separately. Both of us the kind of people who could share a space without needing to fill it with noise. But we kept running into each other in the kitchen. 7 in the morning, 11 at night, not uncomfortable. Just 2 people noticing each other and deciding, each time, that they didn't mind. Then came the night she walked in holding her phone in both hands, like it was something that might break. It was raining. I was finishing the dishes. That was my routine after a long day. The warm water, the simple rhythm of it. She came in without her usual knock on the doorframe and walked straight up to the counter and held the screen out toward me. A text from her father, Richard Calloway, retired attorney, Connecticut. He and her mother, Ellen, were coming to Portland tomorrow morning. The problem: Nora had told her family she was in a serious relationship. That person was supposed to be me. She had never once asked me about it. "If you don't want to, just say no," she said. "I'll handle it myself." What I remember most isn't the ask. It's the way she said if you don't want to, like she'd already assumed the no, like she'd built the rejection into the question before she'd even finished asking it, like she was apologizing for daring to ask at all. I set the dish down. "Tell me the whole story first," I said. She sat at the kitchen table until 1 in the morning, talking in pieces and out of order. I didn't interrupt once. Her parents, Richard and Ellen, were New England traditionalists. not cruel about it, just clear. They expected their daughter settled before 30, with someone steady, someone they could see. It was love expressed in the only language they knew, which happened to be worry. She'd been with someone named Derek for 3 years. When it ended, Derek told her it was because her family was too much pressure. What was actually true was that Derek had never wanted the same things she did, and had used her family as a convenient exit from a commitment he'd never intended to honor. After Derek, every call home carried the same undercurrent. Then, 6 weeks before that night, she'd been on the phone with her father after a long, hard day, and she'd heard herself say it. "I'm already seeing someone, Dad." There was no one. She'd said it because it was the only exit from that conversation that didn't require a harder argument she wasn't ready to have. And then her father had booked flights. I listened to all of it. When she finished, I asked, "Do you want to tell them the truth?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I do. But I'm not strong enough to break my dad's heart twice in the same year." I understood that. Not abstractly the way you understand something you've lived through. The way you understand it when you've also chosen silence over the harder conversation and had to sit with what that cost you later. She got out a legal pad and started writing a list. Questions her parents might ask. Things they'd expect to know. Her handwriting was small and even the kind that belongs to someone who has been careful with things for a long time. When she finished the first column, she slid the pad across the table to me. I read through it. Then I started answering. I treated it like a technical problem. Give me a system. Give me the variables. Identify the stress points, and I can work through it methodically. She had a question. I had an answer. Between the two of us, we could build something solid enough to hold for one afternoon. What do you do? Easy. I told her exactly what I actually do the job, what it involves, what I find meaningful about it, what the real constraints are day to day. She looked at me when I finished and said, "That's actually a perfect answer." I wasn't sure if she meant the content or the delivery, just the plain facts, no performance attached. I didn't ask, "How long have you been together?" We looked at each other across the table. I said, 4 weeks. She said, "We say 4 months." I nodded. 4 months was credible. 4 months was enough time to account for the level of ease she'd need to project convincingly through an entire afternoon of careful parental attention. She paused after writing it down. Then she looked up. "You're taking this more seriously than I expected." I told her I didn't know how to do things any other way. She considered that for a moment, then moved on to the next question. Then she got to the hard one. She read it off the pad without looking up. "Do you love her?" I stopped. She didn't push me. She just waited, pen resting still against the paper, watching me work through it. "I'll answer that one when it comes up," I said. She wrote something on the pad and didn't ask me to explain. I still don't know whether she took that as avoidance or as something else. Honestly, at that point in the night, I couldn't have told you myself. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning. I straightened up the living room not because anyone asked, just because it needed doing. Moved some mail off the coffee table, wiped down the kitchen counter, and I made coffee the way I'd figured out she liked it over the past 4 weeks. Mocha pot, medium roast, a longer steep, no sugar. She'd never told me any of that. I'd just been paying attention in the way you pay attention to things that have started to matter before you fully acknowledge to yourself that they do. When she came out of her room, the mug was already on the table. She stopped and looked at it. Then she looked at me. I was on the couch tying my shoes and didn't look up. "You didn't have to do all this," she said. "I know," I said. She stood there for another moment, holding the mug, not drinking it yet. Then she went to get ready. That was all we said to each other that morning, but I think we both understood considerably more than what got spoken, understood it in the particular way that two people understand things when they've stopped needing to translate everything into words. Her parents arrived just after noon. I heard the car before I saw them, a measured, unhurried parking job that somehow already told me something about the man behind the wheel. Richard Calloway was compact, silver-haired, dressed precisely, the kind of man who has never needed his clothes to make a statement on his behalf. His handshake was firm and his eyes moved in that slow, calibrating way that belongs to someone who has learned to assess things quickly out of long habit. Not hostile, just thorough. I recognized that look immediately. My own father had been giving it to me for the first 20 years of my life. Ellen Calloway was warmer in how she showed it, though probably not softer underneath. She asked me within the first 5 minutes whether I was eating regularly, framed as a question, functioning as information gathering. I recognized it immediately. That wasn't interrogation. That was the language of a mother who worries and doesn't have another register for it. When Nora introduced me, she stood slightly closer than she normally would, just enough that I noticed the shift. I didn't step back. Richard asked about my work over coffee. I answered directly what the job involves, what I find worthwhile about it, the real limitations. No overselling, no performance of humility. He asked one follow-up question, got his answer, nodded once, and moved on. With a man like Richard Calloway, silence after a direct answer is its own form of approval. I recognized it because I'd spent years learning to read that exact silence from my own father and trust what it meant. We moved to dinner as evening came on. Nora had cooked more than 2 people needed. She'd been in the kitchen for 2 hours that afternoon, quietly, without saying anything about it. The table had that look of careful thought. Candles, good wine glasses, cloth napkins folded the way her mother had probably shown her, the kind of detail you only apply when something matters considerably more than you want to say out loud. We were in the middle of the meal when Richard set his wine glass down and looked at me squarely the way a man looks when he genuinely wants an answer and has no patience for anything that isn't it. "Cal, how serious are you about my daughter?" The table went quiet. I felt Nora go completely still beside me, not a flinch, just a total absence of movement. Like she was holding her breath without wanting anyone to notice. I set my glass down. I looked at him. "I don't have a scripted answer for you, sir," I said. "But I can tell you this. When I'm around Nora, I don't have to work at being someone I'm not. That's the rarest thing I've come across in a long time." I hadn't prepared that. It came from somewhere I hadn't consciously reached, and the moment it did, I knew it was true. Ellen pressed her hand to her chest. Richard looked at his daughter, and Nora looked at me. For the first time all evening, she actually looked not the managed, carefully composed version she'd been offering since her parents walked in. Something real, the look of someone who has just heard something they didn't let themselves hope for. Under the table, her hand found mine. She held it for 1 second, just one, and then let go. I didn't look down. I held my expression completely steady, but I felt every single one of her fingers. I want to be honest about what I felt when I heard Jade's voice. It wasn't longing. It wasn't anger. It was more like the feeling of stepping onto a stair you were completely certain was there, and finding it isn't a quick, disorienting lurch, and then nothing. Just the floor under you. 14 months since she'd left, and I still knew her voice from inside the kitchen before I'd even processed that the front door had opened. It was late afternoon. Richard and Ellen were in the living room finishing their wine. The conversation between them, the kind that happens naturally between 2 people who have shared 50 years of life together, easy and unhurried, full of the small shorthand that accumulates over decades. I was at the sink rinsing the last of the plates, glad to have something to do with my hands. The doorbell rang. Nora crossed the floor and opened the door. And then I heard Jade. "Hey, I'm Jade Cal's ex. I left something here." She said it directly to Nora. Not a question, not an apology, not framed as a request. Just a statement of fact. And then she came inside. I stepped out of the kitchen in time to watch her move through the entryway, the way she always moved through rooms like she'd already decided she belonged there, and was giving everyone else a moment to catch up. She was wearing a coat I didn't recognize. Her hair was shorter. She looked good. She always had. That had never been the part that was wrong. Her eyes swept the room carefully, not casually, but with purpose. She registered the bookshelf that wasn't mine. The mocha pot on the counter, the remnants of dinner on the table, candles burned down another inch. She registered Richard and Ellen on the couch, both watching her with the composed neutrality of people who know better than to form opinions before they have the whole picture. Then she looked at me. "Oh, you're still here? I thought you might have moved by now. This is my apartment, Jade, right?" She smiled, the kind that doesn't quite make it to the eyes. "I just forgot a scarf." The gray one. I did not remember any gray scarf, and I knew, watching her stand there taking in the room with that quiet, measuring attention, cataloging what had changed, where I was now relative to where she'd left me 14 months ago, that she had not come here for any scarf. She had come to take a reading, to see if the answer was still the same one she'd left behind. Nowhere. Still held in the silence she'd decided wasn't worth staying for. She made her way into the living room and settled onto the arm of the chair across from Nora's parents, introducing herself with the easy warmth she'd always had with strangers, the kind of warmth that reads as genuine openness from a distance, but is really just very accomplished social performance. She asked Ellen something about the drive up, about whether they'd come straight through. Ellen responded politely, with visible effort. Richard said nothing at all. He watched her with the same quiet, calibrating attention he'd turned on me when he arrived, and I found myself, unexpectedly, grateful for it. Then Jade turned to Nora with a pleasant expression. "Are you his roommate?" I will remember Nora's answer for the rest of my life, not for what she said, but for the way she said it, level, clear, without a single beat of hesitation anywhere in it, the way you read a plain fact off a page. "I'm his girlfriend." Jade's smile didn't leave. It just adjusted slightly at the edges, a small, almost invisible recalibration, like a quiet revision being made just behind still eyes. "Oh, really? He never mentioned you to me." Nora held her gaze. "Probably because he doesn't discuss old relationships with his current one." I was standing in the kitchen doorway when she said that, one hand on the doorframe. I didn't move, didn't step in, didn't try to redirect anything, didn't do the thing where you place yourself between two people to manage what's happening. Not because I was afraid to, because Nora didn't need me to, and I think, somewhere in the back of my mind, I already knew that about her, had known it for a while, actually, without ever having had a reason to see it confirmed. She knew exactly what was happening, and was meeting it with a precision that genuinely stopped me because I had never once seen it from her before. This was a woman I had watched choose silence over confrontation every single time the choice was available, who absorbed hard things rather than push back on them, who managed her own difficult feelings with the careful patience of someone who had long decided that keeping the peace was worth the cost. And here she was, holding a line with no raised voice, no performance of any kind, just calm, absolute refusal to move. Jade held her gaze for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and produced a gray scarf I had genuinely never seen before that day, brought with her specifically for this visit, and turned toward the door. She stopped in the entryway, looked back at me. "You look the same," she said, still quiet. She always said it like that, as a compliment with something sharp folded inside it, something intended to catch and stay. It had worked on me for a long time. I'd spent too many evenings after that replaying sentences like it, trying to figure out whether the quietness she kept naming was a flaw I needed to correct, or a judgment she'd already rendered about what I was worth. I'd run that loop in my head for 2 solid years, adjusting, second-guessing, trying to be louder, more reactive, more of whatever it seemed like she needed, before I finally understood that the sentence was designed precisely to do what it did. To leave something working in me long after she'd already left the room, to keep me oriented around her even when she was gone. That's a very specific kind of sentence. I'd learned to recognize it too late, and not to let it land anymore. "I hope she likes it more than I did." She looked at Nora, then slowly, from the ground up, the kind of deliberate look built to be felt, and she turned and walked out. That's when Nora's hand found mine under the table, not gently, the way it had been earlier in the evening. This time she gripped it, fingers cold, hold tight, and she pulled me just slightly toward her, maybe 1 inch, and she leaned up close to my ear and said it, barely above a breath. "Please kiss me." I looked at her. 1 second, 2, before I could do anything, she leaned up and kissed me, right on the mouth. Soft, brief, decided the kiss of someone who has already made up their mind and has no intention of going back on it. I went completely still. Behind us, I heard footsteps stop. I did not look up. Then, the front door closed. When I turned back to Richard and Ellen, they weren't looking at each other. They were looking at us. Richard had his hands flat on the table, completely still, the posture of a man who is watching something he has been waiting to see confirm itself. Ellen had both hands pressed together against her mouth, and then, slowly, they both smiled, small and warm, the kind that belongs to two people who have seen enough of life to recognize something genuine when it happens right in front of them, and who are quietly, privately glad they were there when it did. Richard shook my hand at the door before they left, firmer than the first time, held it a moment longer before releasing. "I appreciate a man who answers a direct question directly," he said. Then he walked down the hallway without looking back. I stood in the doorway longer than I needed to. The corridor smelled like old carpet and whatever the neighbors were cooking, and I found myself thinking about the fact that one sentence from Richard Calloway probably carried more genuine weight than most formal evaluations I'd ever received. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean. He was not a man who gave anything easily. I'd understood that about him by the end of the afternoon, and I understood what it had cost him to say even that much. Ellen hugged Nora before leaving. Long and unhurried, not the kind of hug that's about comfort, but the kind that's about holding on before you have to let go. She whispered something into Nora's hair that I couldn't make out from where I was standing. Whatever it was, Nora had closed her eyes and gone completely still. When the apartment was just ours again, it felt like something had been released from the air, like the room had been holding its breath all afternoon, and had finally been allowed to let it go. Nora sat down on the floor of the living room. Not the couch, the actual floor, back against the bookshelf, knees drawn up toward her chest, like she needed to feel solid ground directly under her. I'd seen her sit that way exactly once before, after a phone call with a client that went badly sideways. Some weight is simply too much for furniture. I sat down across from her, not close enough to crowd her. The distance of someone who respects where a person is right now and isn't going to press for anything. The living room was very quiet. The candles on the dinner table had burned down to stubs. The wine glasses were still there on the cloth. Everything looked exactly the way it had 2 hours ago, and none of it was the same. "I'm sorry," she said. "For all of it. You don't have anything to apologize for. I dragged you into my situation. I chose to be in it. Nobody dragged me anywhere." She looked up at the ceiling for a moment the way people do when they're trying to keep their eyes from doing something they don't want. "I don't know what I want anymore. With Derek, I thought I had it figured out. Now I just know what I don't want. I'm not sure that's enough to build anything on." "Start there," I said. She looked at me. "Start with what I don't want? That's still knowing yourself. That's more than most people have at any given point." She was quiet again for a moment. "That's a very engineer way of looking at it." I told her engineers were actually very good at starting from constraints. She almost smiled. Not quite. There was a long quiet between us. The kind that doesn't need filling, that only accumulates between two people when both of them are comfortable enough to just let it be there without reaching to close it. Then she asked me something I hadn't prepared for. "That thing you said to my dad about not having to work at being someone else. Was that real? Or was it just the right thing to say?" I looked at the crack in the kitchen wall. The L-shaped one I'd never patched. "I spent 2 years trying to be what Jade needed me to be," I said. "And I didn't understand how much of myself I'd given away in the process until she was already gone, until I was standing in a quiet apartment trying to remember what I actually liked, what I read when no one was watching, how I wanted to spend a Saturday morning. Simple things I'd stopped trusting myself about. I hadn't said any of that out loud before. Not to anyone. It sat between us in the air, and I waited to feel like I'd said too much. I didn't. Nora didn't say I understand. She didn't reach for anything people say when they want to make a silence feel smaller. She just looked at me and nodded slowly, the kind of nod that means a person has actually heard you, not at the surface level but lower down, where things settle and stay. She stood up after a while. When she looked at me, it was straight and clear. "I want to tell them the truth. Not today, but soon. I can't keep building on something I made up." She held my gaze. "Would you be there when I do? Do you want me there?" She thought about it honestly rather than quickly. "I don't know yet." "Then when you know," I said, "just tell me." She went to her room. I stayed in the living room in the quiet the afternoon had left behind, looking at that crack on the wall, the L-shaped one above the backsplash, the one I'd repainted around twice and never touched. For the first time since I'd moved into this apartment, I thought, maybe I never patched it because I was waiting for something I didn't have a name for yet. Maybe the things we leave unfinished are their own kind of honesty, a record of where we were and what we were still waiting to understand about ourselves. The things we couldn't close off yet because closing them would have meant giving up on something we hadn't been able to articulate. I sat there for a while. I wasn't in a hurry to go anywhere. The apartment was quiet in the particular way it gets when something has shifted in it, not empty, just changed. 3 weeks went by. I would call them quiet. But that's not quite the right word, not quiet in the way. An empty room is quiet. More like the way a room feels when it's already full and doesn't need noise to prove it. The kind of quiet that builds rather than just sits. She started leaving coffee for me in the mornings. Just the mocha pot on the back burner with a mug set out beside it. No note, no mention of it. Just there when I came into the kitchen, I noticed the first time, and the second, and somewhere after that, it stopped being something I consciously noticed and started being something I simply counted on. The way you count on things that have quietly become part of how your day begins, before you thought to decide about them. I fixed to the bookshelf that had been leaning slightly since her first week. One of the wall anchors hadn't caught right, and the whole unit had a barely visible list that bothered me every time I walked past. I went at it on a Saturday morning while she was out. She came back, looked at it, didn't say anything about it. That evening there was a note on the kitchen table in her small, careful handwriting. "Thank you. The philosophy section is no longer a hazard." I read it twice, folded it, and put it in the kitchen drawer. It's still in there. We started cooking together on Sunday evenings. No one proposed it, it just accumulated the way certain good things do when two people stop performing around each other. I was in the kitchen. She wandered in, she started cutting something, and at some point we were making the same meal without having discussed it. She cut vegetables wrong by any technical standard but fast, and I never corrected her. I adjusted my own timing to match her pace instead. I caught myself doing it on the fourth or fifth Sunday, and when I did, it felt like information I hadn't known I was collecting. One night she sat on the kitchen counter the way she sometimes did, legs hanging over the edge, back against the upper cabinet, tea mug held in both hands, and talked about Derek. Not the way you talk about something you're still in the middle of, the way you revisit something once you've already made your peace with it, just to confirm that your memory of it is still accurate, that you haven't softened or sharpened it into something it wasn't. "He wasn't a bad person," she said. "He just didn't want what I wanted." And instead of saying that early, he stayed long enough for me to actually believe in it. Then he left. "That's worse than leaving early," I said. "Yeah." A pause, though I kept looking for evidence that confirmed what I already wanted to believe. So some of that's on me. Rain against the window, the mocha pot cooling on the back burner. Then she asked me something I hadn't been bracing for. "Cal, why did Jade say you never made her feel anything?" I thought about how to answer honestly, without making it bigger than it was. "I'm not dramatic," I said. "She needed someone who would react, who would fight back, perform, make everything feel urgent all the time. I don't work that way. I go quiet, I move slowly. I process things internally." She called it being cold. Said it felt like talking to a wall. Nora looked down at her mug. "Not at me. I'd call it safe," she said. She said it quietly enough that my first instinct was to make her repeat it. I didn't. I just let it stay exactly where she'd placed it. 8 weeks after the afternoon with her parents, I started noticing things I had never tracked before. The specific way she frowned at a draft she wasn't satisfied with, a small compression between her brows, 2 vertical lines that appeared and then smoothed away once she'd made a decision. The way she always apologized when she coughed too loudly at night, even when I was clearly still awake, the trained reflex of someone who had spent a long time believing that taking up space required permission. The way she laughed, she was selective about it, but when she did, she didn't cover her mouth, she just laughed. Completely, and that was the end of it. I didn't try to make meaning out of any of it while it was happening. I just let it accumulate. The way you're supposed to let the important things accumulate when you're wise enough not to rush them toward conclusions they haven't reached yet. There's something honest in that approach, in letting something be real for a while before you decide what to name it, before you turn it into a decision or a declaration. Some things deserve to just exist first, uncategorized, before you do anything with them. She called her father on a Wednesday evening. I was in my room with the door cracked open, not intentionally listening but aware the call was happening. I couldn't make out words, just the shape of the conversation. Tight at first, then something releasing somewhere in the middle, then slower, then a long silence. 15 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were red at the edges, but she wasn't crying. She stood in the hallway a moment and said, "He went quiet for a long time. And then he said he needed time to think. She paused. "That's better than I thought it would go." I got up. Didn't say anything. Walked to the kitchen and filled the mocha pot. "How do you want it tonight?" I asked. She pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table, watching me at the stove, hands folded in her lap. She looked tired, but not the bad kind. The kind that comes after something difficult that went better than you expected, where you're still processing the fact that you got through it in one piece. The kind that sits in the body as relief, rather than exhaustion. However you like making it, she said. I made it the way I make it for myself, which is stronger than most people like and without any of the things people usually add to make it more palatable. I set it in front of her and sat down across the table. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at it for a moment before drinking. Then she looked up at me. I understood what she meant. It wasn't really about the coffee. I made it the way I make it for myself, not adjusted for anyone else, just the way I actually like it, and set it down in front of her. We sat in the kitchen afterward, in the kind of quiet that two people can only share when they've already said the things that matter and don't need to fill the rest. It was a Sunday. We were at the sink together, rinsing the dinner dishes, some radio station playing low from the little speaker on the counter. I don't remember which one of us had turned it on. The water was warm. The kitchen smelled like dish soap and coffee that had gone cold hours earlier. Our hands reached for the same dish towel at the same moment. Neither of us moved. The water kept running in the sink. The radio kept playing something low and undistinguishable. A whole quiet second went by, and then another one after it. She looked down at where our hands were close, not quite touching, and then looked up at me. The first time I asked you to kiss me, she said, it was panic. I want you to know that's what it was. I know. This isn't panic. I set the dish I was holding down on the counter, turned toward her. Then what is it? I asked. She met my eyes. It's just what I want. I put my hand against her cheek carefully, the way you touch something you're not entirely sure you have the right to. She didn't pull back. She didn't look away. The water was still running. The radio was still going, and I thought, there it is. That's what I didn't have a name for. I don't know exactly when I fell in love with her. I can't point to a single moment and say, that one. What I know is that it didn't arrive loudly. It came the way the structural things come, quietly, incrementally, one small weight at a time, until the whole of it was load-bearing without your ever having decided that was the plan. Jade taught me that volume and feeling aren't the same thing. That someone can fill every room with heat and motion and still leave you standing in an empty space. Nora never asked me to be different. She just existed in the same apartment, made coffee, fixed her own quiet problems, left notes, sat on the counter and talked through the things she was still figuring out. Somewhere in all that ordinary, I remembered who I'd been before I started trying to be someone else. That first "please kiss me" panicked. Honest became the story we tell when someone asks how we got together. I tell it. She always adds one detail I left out. She has a better memory for the small things. Richard called back 10 days later. He said, bring him for dinner. We went. I sat at that table and didn't once feel like I needed to prove anything. That was new. We still live in that apartment. Same kitchen. Same crack in the wall. Nora asked why I'd never patched it. I said, because it reminds me that something imperfect can still be home. She went quiet. Then, that's the most romantic thing you've ever said. I told her not to get used to it. She laughed, the real kind. There are people who make you feel like you have to work at being enough. And there are people who remind you that you already were. I spent 2 years learning the difference. Nora didn't explain it to me. She just showed up and kept being herself. And that was all it took. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to ask you 2 things. First, has there been someone who made you feel like you had to become a different version of yourself to be worth keeping? And when they left, honestly, did you feel loss? Or did you feel like you could breathe again? Second, if you had been Nora that night, would you have done it? Or would you have turned away and handled it alone? Leave your answer below. I read every one. If this story landed somewhere real, a like or a subscribe is how you tell me these are worth telling. I'll see you in the next one.